January 30th, 2010, 11:30 at night. Villas de Salvarcar, Ciudad Juárez. A group of students celebrating an 18th birthday, laughing, dancing, taking pictures. Investigators later called it a case of mistaken identity. Nobody in that house had any connection to organized crime, and that single wrong address was only the beginning. These are the 10 horrifying cases of college students killed by the cartel. The Villas de Salvarcar massacre Ciudad Juárez sits right across the border from El Paso, Texas, separated only by the Rio Grande. In early 2010, it was one of the deadliest cities on earth. Two major criminal groups were fighting over the city, because whoever controlled Juárez controlled a direct route for drugs heading into the United States. The Sinaloa Cartel, led at the time by Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, wanted the city. The local group already running it, known as the Juárez Cartel, was not willing to give it up. Their enforcement arm, a group called La Línea, was made up largely of current and former police officers who worked as hired killers. By January 2010, the war between these groups had already killed more than 2,600 people in Juárez the year before. Gun battles in the streets had become common. Bodies turning up in empty lots had become common. Almost none of it, though, had reached inside a family home during a birthday party. On the evening of January 30th, 2010, a group of teenagers gathered at a house in a neighborhood called Villas de Salvarcar, on the southeastern edge of the city. The party was for a young man turning 18. Around 60 people came through that night, most of them students. Some went to a technical high school called CBT's 128. Others were enrolled at a public college prep school known as Colegio de Bachilleres, Campus 9. A few attended the Autonomous University of Ciudad Juárez. Most of the kids in that house were somewhere between 15 and 20 years old. They had music playing, they had food, they were doing what teenagers do at a birthday party anywhere in the world. Laughing, dancing, taking pictures, hanging around in small groups in different rooms of the house. None of them had any connection to organized crime. That detail matters, because of what officials would say about them later. These were students with report cards, part-time jobs, family dinners, and college applications. Some had younger brothers and sisters waiting up for them at home. None of them had done anything that night except show up to celebrate a friend's birthday. At around 11:30 that night, 4 vehicles pulled up outside the house. At least 20 armed men climbed out. They did not knock. They did not call anyone outside first. They walked straight into the party and opened fire. Survivors who spoke to reporters years later described the same chaos from different corners of the house. People screamed and dropped to the floor. Some ran for bedrooms and tried to lock the doors behind them. Some hid in closets. Some tried to climb out through windows. The gunmen kept shooting as they moved from room to room, into the hallway, into the yard outside. It did not last long, maybe a few minutes from start to finish, but in that short amount of time, 15 people were killed and around 10 more were wounded. The dead ranged from 15 to 20 years old. Some were shot in bedrooms where they had tried to hide. Others were killed in the hallway or the patio while trying to escape. There was no ambulance convoy waiting outside. Neighbors and family members who rushed to the sound of gunfire ended up loading wounded teenagers into their own cars and driving them to hospitals themselves, because there was no time to wait for police or paramedics to arrive and sort out what had happened. One survivor, interviewed a decade later, said he took 12 bullets to his legs that night and lived. He was one of the lucky ones. Word spread through the neighborhood within minutes. Parents who had dropped their kids off earlier that evening for what should have been an ordinary party started getting phone calls telling them to come to the hospital, or worse, to come identify a body. A mother named Luz Maria Davila lost 2 sons that night, 16-year-old Marcos and 19-year-old Jose Luis. She would become one of the most public faces of the case in the months that followed, not because she wanted the attention, but because of what happened when Mexico's president came to town. Investigators moved fast to figure out who had ordered the attack and why. What they found took the story in a direction nobody in that house could have predicted. The gunmen had not shown up at the wrong party by pure chance. They believed they were hitting the right house. They just had the wrong information. The order came from a man named José Antonio Acosta Hernandez, who went by the nickname El Diego. Before he became one of the top enforcers for La Línea, he had worked as an officer with the Chihuahua State Police, which is part of why so many people in Juarez distrusted their own local law enforcement during this period. Acosta later told investigators that someone inside his network had passed along bad intelligence. He was told that members of a rival street gang called Los Doblados, who were working with the Sinaloa Cartel, were holding a meeting at a house in Villas de Salvarcar. Based on that tip, he sent a team to wipe them out. The tip was wrong. There was no cartel meeting. There were no rival gang members inside that house. There was a birthday party full of teenagers who had never been part of any of it. The man believed to have led the shooters on the ground, known by the nicknames El 12 and El Rama, did not live long enough to face a courtroom. He was killed a few days later in a separate clash with the Mexican army. That left Acosta, the man who gave the order, as the central figure prosecutors wanted to bring down, along with whoever else they could tie to the 20 or so gunmen who had actually pulled the triggers that night. For the families burying their kids that week, the mistaken identity explanation offered no comfort at all. If anything, it made the randomness of it harder to sit with. Their children had not been targeted for anything they did. They had been in the wrong house, on the wrong night, because of a rumor that turned out to be false. Then came a moment that made the case even harder for many Mexicans to accept. In the days after the massacre, President Felipe Calderón, who had built much of his time in office around a military campaign against the cartels, suggested publicly that the young victims might have had criminal ties themselves, essentially floating the idea that they had been killed because they were involved in something. For grieving families who knew exactly who their kids were, students with no record and no gang connections, this felt like their children were being blamed for their own deaths before the investigation had even finished. Calderón traveled to Ciudad Juárez in February 2010 to try to address the anger building across the country. During that visit, Luz Maria Davila, the mother who had lost both her sons at the party, got hold of a microphone during his public appearance and confronted him directly. She told him she could not welcome him because for her he was not welcome, since it had been years of killing in her city with no justice, and she demanded he take responsibility instead of assuming the worst about murdered teenagers. It was a rare moment of a grieving mother speaking face-to-face with a sitting president on live television, and it forced Calderón to walk back his earlier comments. The pressure from the massacre, combined with the international attention it drew, pushed the Mexican government to launch a program called Todos Somos Juárez, which translates to We Are All Juárez. The idea was to bring together local leaders, business owners, and residents to figure out how to pull the city back from the violence that had consumed it, with promises of new investment in schools, health clinics, and jobs. Whether it actually changed daily life in Juárez in any lasting way is still debated by people who lived through that period, but it marked the first time the federal government publicly admitted that the drug war strategy alone was not working for ordinary families caught in the crossfire. The push for justice inside the courtroom moved slower and hit serious problems along the way. One of the first men arrested in connection with the case was a young man named Israel Arzate Melendez. He confessed to taking part in the shooting. Years later, it came out that his confession had been obtained through torture at the hands of the Mexican army, and Mexico's Supreme Court eventually ruled that his rights had been violated during that interrogation. His case became one of the clearest examples of how badly some of Mexico's early anti-cartel investigations were run, with soldiers pressuring suspects into confessions instead of building cases on solid evidence. In June 2011, a trial did move forward against a small group of men connected to the massacre. 4 of them were convicted, and each received a sentence of 240 years in prison. It sounds like a severe punishment, and on paper it is, but it only accounted for 4 of the roughly 20 gunmen who were actually inside that house the night of the shooting. Looking back a decade later, reporters covering the anniversary of the case found that only 4 out of the 15 or so people eventually identified as having some role in planning or carrying out the attack had ever been sent to prison. Most of the men who fired the shots that killed 15 teenagers were never caught at all. There was one more twist that came out years after the massacre, one that connected this case to a scandal happening on the other side of the border. Some of the weapons recovered from the crime scene were later traced back to a failed operation run by United States federal agents called Fast and Furious. Under that program, agents had allowed licensed gun dealers to sell weapons to suspected smugglers, hoping to track the guns to high-level cartel figures and build bigger cases against them. Instead, agents lost track of many of the weapons entirely, and some of them ended up being used in crimes on Mexican soil, including, according to later reporting, the Villas de Salvarcar shooting. It meant that some of the same guns used to kill teenagers at a birthday party may have been allowed to cross the border by the very government agency meant to be stopping weapons trafficking in the first place. The neighborhood of Villas de Salvarcar never fully shook off what happened there. For years afterward, residents pointed to the case as proof of how little protection ordinary families had during that stretch of Mexico's drug war, and how easily innocent people, especially young people with no ties to any cartel, could be caught in the middle of it. Luz Maria Davila kept speaking out publicly for years, still pushing for the men responsible for killing her sons to be caught and punished, still without full answers by the time later reporters checked back in on the case. 15 students died at that party for a reason that had nothing to do with any of them personally. They were never the target. They were simply in a house that someone, somewhere, pointed a finger at by mistake, and 20 armed men were sent to make sure nobody inside survived the night. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nearly 2 decades before that party in Juarez, another young person from the other side of the border would disappear during a trip meant to be nothing more than fun in the sun, and what happened to him would pull back the curtain on something far stranger than a case of mistaken identity, a case involving a self-declared godfather of black magic who believed killing could make him untouchable. Mark Kilroy. Mark James Kilroy was born on March 5, 1968, in Chicago, Illinois. His father, Jim Kilroy, worked as a chemical engineer. His mother, Helen, was a volunteer paramedic. Not long after Mark was born, the family moved from the Midwest down to Texas, eventually settling in the small town of Santa Fe, just outside Houston. Mark grew up there with his brother Keith. The family attended Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church in the nearby town of Hitchcock, and Mark was raised in that faith his whole childhood. By the time he reached high school, Mark had built a reputation as someone who did things the right way. He was strong in school and just as strong in sports, playing baseball, basketball, and golf. Friends who knew him growing up would later describe him as loyal, obedient, and easy to trust, the kind of person who showed up when he said he would and never gave anyone a reason to worry about him. He started college at Tarleton, where he joined the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity, but he eventually made a decision that would shape the rest of his short life. He gave up his focus on athletics and transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, where he began working toward becoming a doctor. He was studying as a pre-med student and getting ready to take his medical college admission test, the exam every future doctor in America has to pass before applying to medical school. In March 1989, Mark and a group of his college friends decided to do what thousands of American students do every year during spring break. They headed south toward the Texas border for a few days of relaxation before getting back to the grind of school. Their trip took them to South Padre Island, a popular beach destination right at the southern tip of Texas. And from there, like plenty of other spring breakers that week, they crossed the border into Matamoros, Mexico, just a short drive away. Crossing into Matamoros for a night of cheaper drinks and a change of scenery was an extremely common thing for American college students to do at that time, since the drinking age in Mexico was 18, lower than the drinking age back home. Nobody in that group of friends had any reason to think this particular trip across the border would be any different from thousands of others just like it. On the night of March 14, 1989, Mark and his friends were making their way back toward the border crossing after a night out. At some point, the group got separated for what one of his close friends, Ryan Fenley, later described as only a short window of time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes at most. That was all it took. A truck pulled up near Mark, and in a matter of seconds, he was grabbed and driven off. His friends had no idea what they had just witnessed. One moment Mark was there. The next, he was simply gone. At first, the people who knew him assumed the most ordinary explanation possible. Mark was the responsible one in the group, the guy who did not just wander off without telling anyone. So when he did not show up at the meeting point, and did not show up back at the hotel, and did not answer for hours, his friends started to realize something was actually wrong. This was not a case of a college kid losing track of time after one too many drinks. This was a disappearance. His family in Texas were notified, and it did not take long for the case to escalate. Mark's disappearance quickly caught the attention of American authorities, partly because he was a well-liked, clean-cut pre-med student from a respected family, and partly because Matamoros sat directly across from the United States border, meaning American law enforcement had a direct stake in figuring out what had happened to one of their own citizens just a few miles from home soil. Within days, this was not just a missing persons case being handled quietly by local police. It turned into an international manhunt, with agencies from both countries working the case and reporters from around the country following every new detail as it emerged. Mark's disappearance was front-page news across Texas and quickly spread nationally, especially as authorities began connecting his case to a string of other people who had gone missing in the same area over the previous months. That connection was the key to understanding what had actually happened, and it led investigators toward a man who had built an entire criminal operation on lies about black magic. Adolfo Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida, in 1962 to Cuban-American parents. His early life was marked by loss and instability. His father died when Adolfo was still an infant. His mother took him to Puerto Rico for a while and remarried, but that stepfather also died not long after, leaving behind a fair amount of money. She married again, and this time, the new stepfather was involved in both drug trafficking and occult religious practices, a combination that would end up shaping the rest of Adolfo's life. That stepfather taught him a worldview that Constanzo apparently carried with him for the rest of his days, essentially telling him that other people who wanted to destroy themselves with drugs were fair game to profit from, since their weakness was their own problem, not his. Around that same period, Constanzo's mother became convinced that her son had some kind of psychic ability. She introduced him to a religion called Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Caribbean spiritual tradition that includes animal sacrifice as part of its practice. He was also introduced to Santeria, a related but separate religion, around the same time. Constanzo threw himself into Palo Mayombe, working his way up from a basic practitioner known as a palero to eventually claim the highest level in that tradition, a title known as padrino, which essentially means godfather. In 1984, Constanzo moved to Mexico City and set himself up as a tarot card reader. He was physically attractive having worked previously as a male model, and he had a natural charisma that people were drawn to. Combine that with his claim to have real psychic powers and his willingness to perform what he called ritual cleansings, and Constanzo managed to build connections with some very influential people in Mexico City, including wealthy socialites, musicians, and even police officers. Some of these same police officers would later become useful to him in ways that had nothing to do with spiritual guidance. Constanzo's reputation as someone who could predict the future and offer protection through ritual eventually reached the ears of people involved in the drug trade. This was where his religious practice and his criminal ambitions started to merge into one operation. He began telling the drug traffickers he worked with that human sacrifice, performed the right way, could grant them a kind of spiritual shield, making it impossible for law enforcement to catch them or hurt them. Whether Constanzo actually believed this himself or was simply using the claim to build power and control over frightened, superstitious criminals is something investigators have debated ever since. But either way, it gave him enormous influence over the people who worked with him. One of the most important people in Constanzo's operation was a young woman named Sara Aldrete. She was a native of Matamoros, and, at the time she became involved with Constanzo, she was an honors student and cheerleader at Texas Southmost College, a school across the border in Brownsville, Texas. On the surface, she looked like exactly the kind of student anyone would want their own daughter to be. Disciplined, well-liked by classmates, and doing well academically. Underneath that, though, she was dating a drug dealer named Gilberto Sosa, who had connections to a powerful trafficking family known as the Hernandez clan. Constanzo wanted an introduction to that world, and Aldrete was his way in. The two of them met in the late 1980s, and she quickly became one of his most trusted followers. Investigators later concluded that Aldrete's warmth and charm played a critical role in the group's ability to find new victims. Because she seemed so normal, so approachable, and so clearly successful as a student, she was able to get close to people who never would have suspected her of being connected to anything violent. People who classmates described as having no idea about her double life were exactly the kind of targets she and Constanzo needed. Some of the people she helped lure into the group joined willingly, believing in the spiritual promises Constanzo made. Others were simply set up to be kidnapped and killed. Over roughly 2 years, Constanzo and his followers murdered at least 14 people, using their remains in rituals tied to the version of Palo religion the group practiced. These killings mostly stayed under the radar of the American public, since most of the earlier victims were Mexican nationals with connections to the drug trade, people whose disappearances did not generate the same kind of press attention that would eventually surround an American college student's case. The cult operated out of a property called Rancho Santa Elena, a ranch just outside Matamoros that belonged to the criminal network Constanzo was tied into. This ranch became the group's base for the rituals they believed protected their drug trafficking operation from law enforcement. Mark Kilroy became one of the group's victims almost entirely because of bad timing and his appearance. According to accounts from people close to the case, the cult was specifically looking for a white spring breaker that night, and Mark happened to be walking alone for those few crucial minutes when the truck pulled up. He was taken to Rancho Santa Elena and killed there, joining the list of people the group had already murdered. Different accounts have offered slightly different explanations for exactly why he was chosen and what the group believed his death would accomplish for them. Some accounts state that Constanzo told his followers that killing an American and using parts of his body would give the group added protection from American law enforcement specifically. Other accounts state that the group believed removing his brain would somehow transfer his intelligence to them. Whatever the exact belief driving that particular night, the outcome was the same. Mark Kilroy was murdered, and his body was left at the ranch, along with the remains of the group's other victims. Back in Texas, Mark's disappearance had already triggered a full-scale search effort. and pressure from his family and from American officials kept the case in the spotlight for weeks. About a month after he vanished, that pressure paid off. Mexican authorities investigating drug trafficking activity in the area ended up uncovering Rancho Santa Elena and what had been happening there. What they found was almost impossible for investigators to process. The property had been used as a killing ground, and searchers recovered the remains of at least a dozen victims buried or hidden across the site, along with Mark's body among them. For a case that had started as a single missing college student, the scale of what investigators uncovered turned it into one of the most disturbing organized crime stories in recent memory, tying one American student's death to a string of murders that had already been happening for years without drawing nearly the same level of attention. News of the discovery spread fast, and reporters from across the country descended on the story. This was not simply a murder investigation anymore. It was being described as a satanic drug cult that had been sacrificing human beings as part of its operation, and that combination of horror and mystery made it one of the biggest crime stories in the country that spring. For Mark's family, though, the discovery meant the end of weeks of not knowing, replaced by the confirmation of the worst possible outcome, with the ranch exposed and Mexican authorities now actively hunting for the people behind it. Constanzo knew he could not stay in the area any longer. He fled Matamoros for Mexico City, bringing along Sara Aldrete and some of his most loyal followers. For a short time, it looked like he might slip away entirely, disappearing into a city of millions where nobody knew his connection to what had just been discovered outside Matamoros. That did not last. Investigators eventually tracked Constanzo down to an apartment in Mexico City in early May 1989. Police surrounded the building, and what followed was a tense standoff between Constanzo's group and the authorities closing in on them. Rather than surrender and face capture, Constanzo made a final decision that matched the same twisted logic he had used to control his followers for years. He ordered one of his own cult members to shoot him with a machine gun, choosing to die by his own follower's hand rather than be taken alive by police. His order was carried out, and Constanzo died there in that apartment, ending his life on his own terms even as the walls closed in around him. Sara Aldrete was arrested at the scene that same day, along with several other members of the group. For a young woman who had spent years successfully hiding her double life behind a reputation as a model student, her arrest brought that entire disguise crashing down in front of the same kind of national media attention that had followed Mark Kilroy's disappearance for weeks. The case moved toward trial over the following years, though it took time to bring everyone connected to the killings to justice. In 1993, several of the surviving cult members were found guilty on a range of charges, including capital murder and drug trafficking. Some of those convicted claimed during the process that they were innocent of Kilroy's specific murder and said they had only confessed to investigators after being tortured, a claim that added another layer of controversy to a case that was already difficult for authorities on both sides of the border to fully untangle. Even years later, according to available records, a couple of the people connected to the killings were never caught at all and remain unaccounted for. The case left a lasting mark far beyond the courtroom. For years afterward, the story of Mark Kilroy became a cautionary tale told to American college students heading south for spring break. A reminder that a trip meant to be nothing more than a few days of fun could turn into something unimaginable in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ryan Fenley, the friend who was with Mark on that trip and lost sight of him for only a few minutes, spent years afterward telling students they needed to understand just how real that danger had been, especially since so many of today's spring breakers were not even alive when it happened and had never heard the name Mark Kilroy at all. Podcasts, books, and documentaries have continued to revisit the case for decades since. drawn in by the disturbing combination of ordinary spring break tourism, organized drug trafficking, and a self-declared spiritual godfather who convinced desperate criminals that murder could make them untouchable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. More than 3 decades after Rancho Santa Elena was discovered, cases involving American students and cartel violence in Mexico did not stop. What changed was where the world's attention went next, and 5 years before Mark Kilroy's story broke, a different set of students, this time college students from Mexico's own countryside, were about to vanish in a way that would shake an entire nation and never fully be explained. The Ayotzinapa 43, the Raúl Isidro Burgos Rural Teachers College, sits near the town of Tixtla in the Mexican state of Guerrero. It was founded in 1926 as a school meant to train young men from poor farming families to become teachers, especially teachers willing to work in small, remote villages that most people overlooked. The school is all male and has a long history tied to political activism. Students there have always leaned towards socialist ideas, and for decades, the school produced graduates who went on to fight for land reform, better wages, and stronger rights for rural communities. That history made the school a target of suspicion from local and state authorities in Guerrero, who have often treated the students as a threat rather than as future teachers. Part of that suspicion comes from an old wound. In 1995, Guerrero State Police killed 17 unarmed farmers and injured 21 more during a protest, an event that became known as the Aguas Blancas Massacre. That massacre helped give rise to an armed guerrilla group called the Popular Revolutionary Army, and some state officials came to believe that group still had ties to student activists in the region, even though the students themselves always denied any connection beyond sharing similar political beliefs. On top of that political tension, there was a financial one. Bus companies operating in Guerrero were widely believed to pay protection money to organized crime groups just to keep running their routes safely. Any student campaign that disrupted normal bus operations, even temporarily, was seen by these criminal groups as a direct threat to their income and their control over the region. One of the traditions at the Ayotzinapa school involved commandeering commercial buses for student trips, especially trips tied to political protests. Students would board a bus, tell the driver where they needed to go, and use the vehicle for the day before returning it, usually undamaged, to the bus company afterward. According to multiple students who took part in these actions over the years, this practice was treated as routine and temporary, something the bus companies in the area tolerated because it rarely caused any real problems and the buses always came back. This tradition would end up playing a direct role in the tragedy that unfolded in September 2014. On September 26, 2014, a group of students from Ayotzinapa set out to commandeer several buses in the nearby city of Iguala. Their plan was to use these buses to travel to Mexico City for an annual demonstration held every year on October 2, commemorating the anniversary of the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre, when the Mexican government killed an unknown number of student protesters in the country's capital. This kind of trip had been done by Ayotzinapa students many times before, without turning into anything close to what would happen that night. As the students moved through Iguala collecting buses, something went seriously wrong. Police roadblocks appeared, and officers opened fire on the students. What exactly triggered the shooting and how it escalated so quickly has never been fully agreed upon, even years later, but the immediate result was chaos. Officers fired directly at the students, and gunmen who were not in uniform showed up alongside the police as the situation unfolded. Investigators would later identify these plainclothes shooters as members of a criminal cell known as Guerreros Unidos, which translates to United Warriors, a group tied to a larger criminal network called the Beltran Leyva Cartel. During the chaos that night, Police officers shot dead 2 students directly at the scene, and gunfire also killed a taxi driver and his passenger who had nothing to do with the students at all. Another student was shot in the face and survived, badly wounded. As the shooting continued, officers began grabbing students and forcing them into the backs of patrol cars, piling detainees on top of each other, face down, as they were loaded in. Survivors described officers hitting students as they took them into custody, and some students who managed to escape said they gave themselves up out of pure fear of being shot if they kept running. One student, using the nickname Eusebio to protect his identity out of fear of retaliation, later described running through gunfire coming from multiple directions, with police and gunmen blocking off exits from the area. He and another student managed to find a gap and ran down an alley to another street, where a stranger let them hide inside his home overnight out of concern for their safety, even though the man had no idea who they were at first. Eusebio credited that stranger with saving his life. By the next morning, the surviving students who had escaped the chaos gathered cautiously to figure out who was missing. What they discovered was staggering. 43 of their classmates were gone. Nobody knew where they were. Adding to the horror, a 19-year-old trainee teacher named Julio Cesar Mondragon was found dead on a nearby street that morning. He had apparently tried to escape the shooting but did not make it. His body showed signs of torture, and his face had been skinned off, a method that investigators recognized as a signature style of intimidation used by organized crime groups operating in that part of Mexico. Julio's death, separate from the mass disappearance of the 43, became its own symbol of the raw brutality unleashed that night. In total, at least 6 people were killed in the immediate violence, and another 25 were wounded. But it was the disappearance of the 43 students that would grow into one of the most significant human rights cases in modern Mexican history, drawing international attention that lasted for years and, in some ways, still has not fully faded. As details emerged in the days after the attack, suspicion quickly turned toward the mayor of Iguala at the time, José Luis Abarca. Investigators found that Abarca had a troubling history, including past accusations that he had been directly involved in the torture and murder of a local activist years earlier. Even more damaging was the discovery that his wife, María de los Ángeles Pineda Villa, was the sister of several known members of the Beltrán Leiva cartel, the same criminal network connected to the Guerreros Unidos gunmen who took part in the attack on the students. When reporters and investigators pressed Abarca for an explanation of his whereabouts that night, he initially claimed he had been attending a conference and an after-party elsewhere in the city, unaware of what was happening to the students until his secretary called him. He also claimed he had no knowledge of the missing students or any investigation happening at all. Given his wife's direct family ties to the cartel involved, and the corruption already suspected within his local police force, few people outside his own circle believed his account. The Mexican federal government, under President Enrique Peña Nieto, eventually stepped in to take over the investigation after enormous pressure from the students' families and growing public outrage across the country. The man leading that federal investigation was Attorney General Jesus Murillo Caram. About 6 weeks after the students disappeared, on November 7, 2014, Murillo Caram held a press conference to announce what his office believed had happened, a version of events that became known publicly as the historic truth. According to the historic truth, corrupt municipal police officers from Iguala and neighboring towns, acting on orders from Mayor Abarca, had turned the 43 students over to members of the Guerreros Unidos cartel. From there, according to this official version, the cartel members killed the students, then burned their bodies in an open-air fire fueled by wood, tires, and gasoline at a garbage dump in the nearby town of Cocula in an effort to destroy every trace of evidence. Investigators said The ashes were then thrown into the San Juan River. Murillo Karam's announcement was meant to close the loop on one of the most disturbing crimes in the country's recent history. But instead of settling the case, it opened up years of doubt and further investigation that would eventually tear that official story apart. Almost immediately, independent experts and human rights groups raised serious concerns about the historic truth. The confessions used to build that story had come primarily from members of Guerreros Unidos, who were already in custody, and human rights organizations pointed out strong reasons to suspect those confessions had been extracted under torture, a common problem in Mexican criminal investigations at the time. Basic facts within the government's own account did not line up cleanly either. Even the number of buses the students had commandeered that night was reported differently across various official documents, and the accounts given by students who survived the attack did not fully match the government's version of events. Facing growing international criticism, the Mexican government eventually agreed to allow an independent group of experts to examine the case. This group, known by its Spanish acronym GA, was convened with support from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and brought in outside specialists to review the evidence directly rather than rely solely on the domestic investigation. One of the specialists brought in through this process was a fire scientist named Jose Torrero, based at the University of Queensland in Australia, who had previously investigated major fires, including the collapse of the World Trade Center towers on September 11, 2001. Torrero visited the Cocula dump roughly 10 months after the disappearances to examine the physical evidence for himself, and what he found directly contradicted the government's account. He ran a series of experiments using pig carcasses as stand-ins for human bodies, since pigs share a similar body composition to humans in terms of fat and water content. Even when he used 630 kilograms of wood to burn a single 70-kilogram pig, about 10% of the animal's flesh still remained unburned once the fire died down. Based on that math, Torrero calculated that fully burning 43 human bodies of similar weight in the way the cartel members described would have required somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 kilograms of wood, an amount that would have been nearly impossible to gather and burn undetected at that location. He also pointed out that a fire large enough to consume that much wood and that many bodies would have left obvious scorch marks on the trees surrounding the dump, and when he visited the site himself, he saw no such marks at all. His conclusion was direct and blunt. He said investigators should stop focusing on the dump entirely, because that was simply not where the bodies had been destroyed, if they had been destroyed there at all. The doubts around the historic truth kept growing from other directions as well. A separate investigation by journalist Anabel Hernandez suggested an entirely different motive behind the attack, one that had nothing to do with a political protest at all. According to her reporting, the buses the students had commandeered that night may have been secretly carrying a shipment of heroin, without the students having any idea the drugs were even on board. Under this theory, the Mexican army itself intercepted the drug shipment on behalf of the traffickers who owned it, and the students were killed specifically to eliminate any witnesses who might have seen what was happening. This theory placed the Mexican military itself much closer to the center of the case than the government's original story had ever suggested. Over the following years, further evidence continued to point toward a deeper cover-up involving the military. In 2022, Mexican investigators received a massive collection of roughly 23,000 text messages exchanged between members of Guerreros Unidos and various police officers and government officials, handed over by the American Drug Enforcement Administration, which had gathered the material during its own separate investigations. These messages revealed the staggering scope of corruption running through nearly every level of local government in that part of Guerrero, showing police officers, elected officials, an emergency responder who fed the cartel real-time information on police movements, and even a coroner who reportedly provided the cartel with crime scene photos and access to a crematory for destroying bodies. The messages also indicated that soldiers stationed nearby had closely monitored the abduction of the students as it happened in real time, but never stepped in to stop it or help them. In July 2023, the GA released a report stating plainly that Mexico's army, navy, police, and intelligence agencies had known, essentially minute by minute, exactly where the students were being held and what was happening to them throughout that night, and none of them intervened. The push for a fuller accounting of what happened continued under a new Mexican president. After Andrés Manuel López Obrador took office in 2018, he announced the creation of a new Truth Commission specifically dedicated to re-examining the case from scratch, promising to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of which government agency or official it implicated. That renewed investigation led to new arrests, including a dozen soldiers and, remarkably, the very same former Attorney General who had announced the original historic truth, Jesus Murillo Karam himself, who ended up under house arrest in Mexico City as authorities examined his role in the original cover-up. Even so, both the Army and Navy continued to resist fully cooperating with investigators, withholding information that families and human rights groups believed could finally answer their questions. Frustrated by the slow pace and continued resistance from the military, parents of the missing students formally announced in February 2024 that they were ceasing dialogue with the Truth Commission altogether, accusing it of stalling the investigation and placing what they called a puppet commissioner in charge to slow things down. The following month, protesters driving a pickup truck smashed through an entrance of Mexico's National Palace in Mexico City, while President López Obrador was holding a press conference inside the building. Some individuals connected to the case have faced consequences over the years, even as the full truth remains unsettled. Among those held responsible, José Ángel Casarrubias Salgado, known by the nickname El Mochomo, who led the United Warriors Cartel, was eventually sentenced to life in prison in the United States. Gildardo López Astudillo, a high-ranking Guerreros Unidos leader known as El Gil, was connected by investigators to owning one of the trucks used to transport the students that night, and he was later heard on intercepted communication warning the cartel's top leader, Sidronio Casarrubias Salgado, that the group of people they had taken into custody posed a threat to the gang's control over the area, a chilling detail suggesting the students' fate may have already been decided, almost immediately, after they were taken. The human cost of the case, though, comes back again and again to the simple fact that most families still do not have their sons' remains to bury. As of 2025, more than a decade after the students disappeared, only 3 of the 43 have ever been positively identified through DNA testing. The first confirmed identification came in December 2014, when specialists at the University of Innsbruck in Austria matched bone fragments to 19-year-old Alexander Mora Venancio by comparing the DNA to samples provided by his father and 2 brothers. 2 more students, Josivani Guerrero de la Cruz and Christian Alfonso Rodriguez Telumbre, were later identified through similarly painstaking forensic work. The other 40 students remain unaccounted for to this day, their exact fate still unknown despite everything investigators, journalists, and international experts have uncovered. The case sparked an enormous public reaction almost immediately after news of the disappearance spread. On October 22, 2014, more than 50,000 protesters marched through Mexico City demanding answers and the safe return of the missing students. Solidarity demonstrations were held in cities around the world, including London, Paris, Vienna, and Buenos Aires. In the United States, students and professors at the University of Texas at El Paso held their own rally, reading the name of each missing student aloud one by one and collecting signatures for a formal letter of protest to be delivered to the Mexican consulate. Actors, directors, and other members of Mexico's film industry gathered in the city of Morelia and lit 43 candles on the steps of a local theater in a public show of mourning and solidarity. Even as recently as 2024, violence tied to this case has continued. That year, a student protester connected to the Ayotzinapa school named Yanqui Cothan Gomez Peralta was killed in a confrontation with police, a full decade after the original disappearance, showing that the tension between the school and Mexican authorities never fully went away, even after the case became a symbol recognized around the world. The Ayotzinapa case remains, by most measures, the single most extensively investigated instance of cartel violence against students in Mexican history, involving international forensic experts, leaked government communications, and years of political fallout that reached the very top levels of the Mexican government. And yet, even with all of that scrutiny, the basic question that started it all, what actually happened to the 43 students that night, still does not have a full and confirmed answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 years after those students vanished in Guerrero, a very different group of young people would disappear under Mexico's own cameras and headlines once again. This time not activists heading to a protest, but film students working on a class assignment. And what happened to them would end with a method of disposal so extreme that even seasoned crime reporters struggled to describe it. The Guadalajara film students. Guadalajara is the capital of the Mexican state of Jalisco and one of the largest cities in the country. It has a strong reputation for film and media education, drawing young people from across Mexico who want to study filmmaking, screenwriting, and production. Among the schools training these students was the Universidad de Medios Audiovisuales, a film school based in Guadalajara that focused specifically on teaching students the practical side of making movies and television. 3 students at that school were working toward the same goal that thousands of film students share every year, building a portfolio of real projects they could use to break into the industry after graduation. Javier Salomón Aceves Gastelum, Marco Francisco García Avalos, and Jesus Daniel Díaz Nájera were classmates at the school, and in March 2018, they were putting together a class project that required them to shoot footage outside of a normal studio setting. Film school assignments like this are common all over the world. Students are usually sent out with a small crew, some equipment, and a script or shot list, and told to bring back usable footage by a deadline. For these 3, the assignment meant traveling outside the city to find a location that fit what they needed for their project. Jesus Daniel Díaz was dealing with an injury at the time and was using crutches to get around, which meant the group needed to plan their trip with that in mind. Javier Salomón brought along people close to him for the trip as well, including his girlfriend, his cousin Alejandra, and a friend of hers. What was supposed to be a straightforward day of filming for a school assignment turned into something none of them could have anticipated. At some point during their trip, the group's car broke down. Car trouble on a road trip is an ordinary inconvenience almost anyone can relate to, the kind of delay that ruins an afternoon, but rarely turns into anything more serious. For these students, though, that breakdown left them stranded and vulnerable in an area of Jalisco where organized crime groups were actively fighting for control of territory. According to Jalisco state prosecutors, the students were kidnapped by at least 6 armed men while they were dealing with their car problem. What happened next came out slowly, through a combination of prosecutor statements, arrests, and confessions gathered over the following weeks. According to the account given by Jalisco authorities, the men who grabbed the students tortured them and then killed them. The reasoning behind the kidnapping, as investigators pieced it together, had nothing to do with anything the students had actually done. The gunmen apparently believed the students were connected to a rival criminal group and mistook them for members of that gang. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a criminal organization that had grown rapidly over the previous several years to become one of the most powerful and violent groups operating in Mexico, was identified by prosecutors as the organization behind the killings. For the families of Javier, Marco, and Jesus, the nightmare started the way most missing persons cases start, with silence. The students did not come home when they were expected, and they did not answer calls or messages. Loved ones who had no reason to expect anything more serious than a delayed return trip found themselves making frantic calls to friends, checking hospitals, and eventually turning to the police, hoping for an ordinary explanation that never came. News of the disappearance spread through Guadalajara and beyond, driven in large part by the fact that these were 3 young students with no criminal background, doing nothing more dangerous than working on a school project when they vanished. Protests broke out in the city, with demonstrators carrying signs demanding the safe return of the 3 missing students. One placard read simply that it was not 3 who had disappeared, it was all of them. A message meant to capture how deeply the case had struck a nerve with young people across the country who felt like they could just as easily have been in that car. The case reached well beyond Jalisco, and even beyond Mexico's borders, because of who else was watching. Guillermo del Toro, the Academy Award-winning director behind films like Pan's Labyrinth and The Shape of Water, is a native of Guadalajara, and he used his public platform to speak out about what was happening to these students in his hometown. As the search dragged on with no answers, Del Toro posted publicly about the case, expressing the kind of raw disbelief that many people in Mexico were feeling watching the story unfold. His statement captured a sentiment that plenty of ordinary Mexicans shared at the time, that no matter how used to violence a country might have become, some crimes still landed as a shock that words could barely describe. For about a month, the 3 students remained missing, with prosecutors working the case, while families held out hope for a different outcome than the one most people privately feared. Investigators in Jalisco eventually made arrests connected to the disappearance, and the people taken into custody started providing information about what had actually happened to the students. In late April 2018, roughly a month after the students vanished, Jalisco authorities confirmed publicly that Javier, Marco, and Jesus had been killed. The method used to get rid of their remains was almost impossible for the public to process. According to the state prosecutor's office, the killers had dissolved the students' bodies in acid, specifically so that no trace of them would remain. It was a method meant to erase all physical evidence of the crime, leaving grieving families with confirmation that their sons had died, but without bodies to bury or a grave to visit. Among those connected to the case was a young man who had built a following online as an internet personality before his arrest. According to reporting on his case, he admitted to police that he had been the one responsible for dissolving the students' remains in acid, and he told investigators he was being paid a relatively small weekly amount, reported at around $159, for doing this kind of work for the cartel. The detail that someone with an online audience and an ordinary-looking public presence could also be quietly working as a body disposal specialist for organized crime added another layer of disturbing detail to a case that already felt impossible to fully make sense of. The public reaction to these details, once they became known, was intense. Del Toro's earlier tweet about the case captured what a lot of people were feeling once the full picture came into focus, that the reasoning behind the killings made no sense at all, while the method used to destroy the evidence was almost too extreme to comprehend. 3 students had died because armed men guessed wrong about who they were, and then those same armed men had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure nothing physical was left behind to prove it. The prosecutor leading the case at the time, Raul Sanchez, confirmed that at least 2 people had been arrested in connection with the killings as the investigation continued. Mexican authorities framed the case publicly as another grim example of how deeply embedded cartel violence had become in daily life in Jalisco, a state that by 2018 had already earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous parts of the country because of the rapid rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Understanding why this cartel had grown so powerful by the time these 3 students were killed helps explain why an area near Guadalajara had become dangerous enough for something like this to happen in the first place. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, often referred to by the initials CJNG, expanded aggressively across Mexico in a relatively short period of time. Within about 6 years of the group's emergence, it had built out a network stretching from coast to coast, becoming one of the criminal groups with the greatest operating reach in the entire country. By the time these students disappeared, the cartel was known to run more than 100 methamphetamine labs across Mexico, and its overall drug trade, combining cocaine and methamphetamine sales, was estimated to bring in billions of dollars a year. A criminal organization operating at that scale, with that much money and manpower behind it, treated any perceived threat to its territory or its operations with extreme, often disproportionate violence. And 3 film students with car trouble were simply in the wrong place at a moment when that violence turned outward, without any real verification of who it was hitting. This pattern, killing first based on suspicion and only sorting out afterward whether the suspicion was accurate, was not unique to this one case. It reflected a broader and deeply troubling trend across cartel violence in Mexico during this period, where entire groups of people, sometimes strangers to each other, sometimes just people, caught together in the wrong location, were treated as legitimate targets based on rumors, bad information, or surface-level assumptions about who they might be connected to. For 3 students working on a class project, that pattern turned an ordinary school assignment into an unrecoverable loss for their families and their entire school community. The disappearance and killing of Javier, Marco, and Jesus also highlighted something else uncomfortable about daily life in parts of Mexico during this period. These were not gang members. They were not caught up in any criminal activity of their own. They were students, the same kind of young people filling classrooms in film schools and universities all over the world, chasing the same basic goal of finishing a degree and building a career. Their case became one more entry in a long and painful list of young Mexicans whose educational pursuits ended in violence they had no part in causing, a pattern that repeated itself in different cities and different states throughout Mexico's ongoing struggle with cartel power. For the families left behind, there was no body to recover and bury in the way most grieving families are able to do. The acid used to destroy the students' remains had been chosen specifically to prevent exactly that kind of closure. Instead, what these families were left with were confessions, official statements from prosecutors, and a confirmed timeline of what had happened to their sons, without any physical remains to lay to rest. For a case that started with 3 students simply trying to finish a school project, the ending left behind almost nothing except grief, outrage, and a string of unanswered questions about how easily lives like theirs could be erased by men who never even knew their names before that day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 5 years after these 3 film students disappeared on a routine trip for a class assignment, a different group of young friends in Jalisco would receive an offer that sounded like an ordinary chance at a better-paying job, and what happened to them after they showed up for that meeting would end up being filmed and broadcast for the entire country to see. The Lagos de Moreno 5. Lagos de Moreno is a mid-sized city in the eastern part of the Mexican state of Jalisco, known for its colonial architecture and its annual cultural festivals that draw visitors from across the region. It sits along a stretch of territory that has become increasingly contested between 2 of Mexico's most powerful and violent criminal organizations, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known by the initials CJNG, and the Sinaloa Cartel. Both groups have fought for control over specific neighborhoods within the city, including one called La Orilla del Agua, a name that would come up repeatedly once investigators started piecing together what happened to 5 young men from the area in August 2023. Jaime Adolfo Martínez Miranda, Dante Cedillo Hernández, Diego Alberto Lara Santoyo, Roberto Olmeda Cuellar, and Uriel Galván González were childhood friends who had grown up together in Lagos de Moreno. Their ages ranged from 19 to 22. Friendships like theirs, built over years of growing up in the same neighborhood, going to the same schools, and staying close into early adulthood, are common everywhere, and there was nothing unusual about this particular group of young men beyond how long they had known each other and how tightly connected they remained as they moved into their 20s. In the second week of August 2023, the 5 friends attended a local festival together in Lagos de Moreno. Festivals like this are a normal part of life in the city, drawing large crowds for music, food, and general celebration, and there was nothing about the event itself that suggested any danger. After the festival wrapped up, the group made plans to meet with someone for what they believed was a legitimate job opportunity. According to reporting from the Mexican outlet El Universal, the leading explanation investigators developed was that the young men had reached out to a call center advertising employment, the kind of operation that promises good pay and solid benefits to attract applicants looking for steady work. What the 5 friends did not know, according to that same reporting, was that the call center they had contacted was allegedly being run by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, specifically as a tool for forced recruitment. The setup worked by luring people in with the promise of an ordinary job, then using that initial contact as a way to pull them into the cartel's operations against their will. This kind of recruitment tactic, disguising cartel recruitment behind fake job postings, is not something unique to this one case. Reporting on organized crime in Mexico has documented similar call center schemes used by other criminal groups in different parts of the country, where young people respond to what looks like a normal help-wanted ad, only to find themselves being pressured, coerced, or outright forced into joining a cartel once they show up for what they thought was a job interview. For the 5 friends from Lagos de Moreno, this appears to be exactly the kind of trap they walked into, believing they were pursuing steady work and instead placing themselves directly in the hands of an organization that had no interest in offering any of them a paycheck. On Friday, August 11, 2023, the 5 young men were last seen in their hometown. Witnesses later told authorities that the group had been grabbed directly from their car. According to those accounts, the men were pulled out of their vehicle and forced into a white pickup truck, along with a van that had its windows blacked out, a detail that made it impossible for anyone nearby to see who was inside once the group was moved. From that point forward, none of the 5 men were heard from again by their families, and the search for them began almost immediately once it became clear they had not come home. For several days, the disappearance played out the way most missing persons cases do at the start, with families making calls, checking with friends, and eventually turning to authorities once it became obvious something had gone seriously wrong. What made this case different from an ordinary missing persons report was what happened next. A video began circulating that showed the 5 friends had been captured and were being held by armed men. The footage, once it reached the public, made clear that whatever had happened to this group of childhood friends was far more serious and far more brutal than a simple abduction. The video showed the 5 young men bound and on their knees, with tape placed over their mouths and their hands tied behind their backs. It later aired on Mexican national television, exposing the full scope of what had been done to them to a nationwide audience. According to reporting on the footage, the men had been asked whether they would agree to work as hitmen for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. When they refused, the men holding them followed through with a punishment meant to send a message far beyond just the 5 friends involved. The footage showed one of the young men being forced, presumably at gunpoint, to beat, stab, and ultimately behead one of his own friends, while the others were held nearby, forced to witness what was happening to someone they had known since childhood. This method, forcing captives to kill each other rather than simply executing them outright, was not new to Mexico's drug war. A similar tactic had been used years earlier by the Zetas cartel, a group that broke away from the Gulf cartel and became known for extreme, almost theatrical brutality during the early years of Mexico's modern cartel violence. Back in 2010, members of the Zetas would abduct men traveling on passenger buses passing through their territory and force those who refused to join the organization to beat each other to death using sledgehammers, a method meant less about efficiently killing people and more about terrorizing entire communities into compliance. The following year, in 2011, Mexican authorities uncovered 48 clandestine graves in the northern border state of Tamaulipas, containing the remains of 193 people, many of whom had suffered skull injuries consistent with exactly this kind of forced violence. What happened to the 5 friends from Lagos de Moreno echoed that same brutal logic more than a decade later, showing that this particular method of psychological terror had not disappeared from the playbook used by Mexican cartels, even as the specific organizations wielding it had changed over the years. Once the video and photographs connected to the case became public, Mexican authorities moved quickly to respond. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador addressed the situation during one of his regular morning press briefings, describing the killings as very regrettable, though he offered relatively little additional detail during that particular appearance. He did note that federal prosecutors were stepping in to take over the investigation from local authorities in Jalisco, a decision that reflected how seriously the case was being treated, given the clear involvement of organized crime. The search for the 5 friends led investigators to a specific property in the La Orilla del Agua neighborhood, the same contested territory that both the CNAG and the Sinaloa cartel had been fighting over. According to a statement from the Lagos de Moreno prosecutor's office, ministerial agents and investigative police located a house in that neighborhood where they discovered evidence including bloodstains and pieces of footwear, details that strongly suggested this was the location where the 5 young men had been held. On the property, investigators found something else that connected the crime directly to organized crime activity in the area: a brick wall painted over with the logo belonging to the cartel's enforcement unit, a symbol used to mark territory and claim responsibility for violence carried out in that specific location. As the search continued, investigators located 2 cars belonging to the missing men. One of these vehicles had been burned, and inside the wreckage, searchers found the remains of a person. The discovery of the burned vehicle came the day before authorities located the property itself, giving investigators an early and devastating indication of what they were likely going to find once they gained full access to the house connected to the crime. Once investigators searched the property more thoroughly, they discovered 4 burned human skulls. Combined with the remains found inside the burned car, this brought the total number of bodies recovered in connection with the case to 5, matching the number of young men who had disappeared together after the festival. The condition of the remains, badly burned and difficult to fully process, reflected an effort by whoever was responsible to destroy as much physical evidence as possible, a pattern that has shown up repeatedly in cartel violence across Mexico, where burning or otherwise destroying a victim's remains serves the dual purpose of eliminating evidence and adding another layer of horror to the crime itself. One detail from the case added a layer of uncertainty about exactly which criminal organization was ultimately responsible. According to reporting from the Spanish newspaper El País, a mark that appeared on the video released, showing the young men read Pure MZ, a label that has been attributed to Ismael Zambada, known widely by the nickname El Mayo, the longtime leader of the Sinaloa cartel. This detail complicated the picture that had initially pointed toward the Jalisco New Generation Cartel as the group behind the recruitment call center and the abduction itself. Jalisco state prosecutors, for their part, said publicly that they had not yet confirmed which of the two cartels fighting for control of the La Orilla del Agua neighborhood, Chain-G or the Sinaloa cartel, was actually responsible for the video and the killings. Given that both organizations were actively fighting over that same piece of territory at the time, and given how frequently rival cartels in Mexico use symbols and messaging specifically to implicate their enemies or claim credit for violence, the exact identity of the group that carried out this particular killing remained murky even after the physical evidence had been fully processed. What stayed consistent throughout the investigation, regardless of exactly which organization pulled the trigger, was the underlying story local reports built around the case. According to that reporting, the young men had reached out to what appeared to be a legitimate call center in search of paying work, only for that inquiry to become the mechanism used to draw them into a trap. Once contact was made, the group was directed to meet in person, and it was during that meeting, or shortly afterward, that they were seized and taken to the property where they would eventually be filmed, forced to turn violence against each other, and ultimately killed. For the families of these 5 young men, the days between their disappearance and the confirmation of their deaths were filled with the same agonizing uncertainty that has become tragically familiar to thousands of other families across Mexico who have lost loved ones to cartel violence over the past 2 decades. Unlike some cases where families are left with nothing but silence for months or years, this case moved from disappearance to confirmed death in a matter of days, driven largely by the fact that the video itself, along with the discovery of the burned remains, left little room for lingering hope that the outcome might be different. The public reaction to the case, once full details became known, reflected both horror at the specific brutality involved and a broader sense of exhaustion with a pattern of violence that had, by 2023, been playing out across various regions of Mexico for well over a decade. News outlets covering the story pointed directly to the historical echo between this case and earlier cartel violence from the Zetas era, drawing a direct line between the sledgehammer killings of 2010 and the forced beheading captured on video in 2023. A reminder that even as the specific organizations dominating Mexico's drug trade had shifted over the years, some of the most extreme and theatrical forms of violence used to terrorize communities and enforce recruitment had never actually gone away. This case also highlighted something specific about how cartel recruitment tactics had evolved by 2023. Rather than relying purely on intimidation within neighborhoods already under their control, or targeting people already known to have some connection to rival gangs, groups like the Jeng had reportedly developed more sophisticated methods for pulling in new recruits, methods that specifically targeted young people looking for legitimate employment during a period of economic uncertainty. A fake job posting requires very little effort to set up and can reach a much wider pool of potential targets than traditional recruitment methods limited to people already embedded in criminal networks or specific neighborhoods. For 5 friends simply looking for a way to earn steady income, that low barrier to being targeted turned an ordinary job search into a fatal trap. The specific request made of the 5 friends before they were killed, being asked directly whether they would work as hitmen for the cartel, also reflects a broader trend in how criminal organizations in Mexico have approached the ongoing need for manpower. Running a drug trafficking operation at the scale maintained by groups like the Jeng requires enormous numbers of people willing to carry out violence on the organization's behalf, and turnover within these roles tends to be high given how frequently members of these groups are killed by rival cartels, killed by Mexican security forces, or arrested and imprisoned. Recruiting through fake job offers, then giving targets an ultimatum once they are already captured and isolated, gives these organizations a direct pipeline for replacing lost manpower, using coercion rather than persuasion to fill roles that few people would willingly volunteer for under any other circumstances. For the 5 friends who refused that ultimatum, the consequence was designed to be as public and as terrifying as possible. Releasing footage of the killing, rather than simply disposing of the bodies quietly, served a clear purpose beyond the deaths of these 5 specific young men. It functioned as a warning, both to anyone else who might be approached through a similar recruitment scheme and to any rival organization that might be watching for signs of weakness or opportunity in the ongoing fight over territory in Lagos de Moreno. The video that eventually aired on national television was not an accident or a leak the killers tried to prevent. It was almost certainly intended from the start to reach as wide an audience as possible. Public reporting on the case does not indicate that any arrests were ever confirmed in direct connection to the killings of these 5 specific young men, and the exact resolution of the investigation, including whether the Jalisco New Generation Cartel or the Sinaloa Cartel was ultimately determined to be responsible, remains unclear based on available reporting. This lack of a confirmed resolution reflects a broader and deeply frustrating reality for families across Mexico dealing with cartel violence, where cases involving clear video evidence and confirmed physical remains can still end without formal accountability. Since prosecuting cartel violence in regions actively contested by multiple armed groups carries enormous risk and often runs into the same corruption, fear, and lack of resources that have made so many other cases in Mexico's drug war difficult to fully resolve. What remains undisputed, regardless of any lingering uncertainty about which specific cartel carried out the killings, is the basic outline of what happened to Jaime, Dante, Diego, Roberto, and Uriel. 5 childhood friends from Lagos de Moreno responded to what looked like a normal job opportunity, were seized by armed men, held in a house tied to organized crime, filmed being forced to turn violence against one another, and ultimately killed, their remains burned in an attempt to destroy the evidence of what had been done to them. Their case became one more entry in a growing list of young Mexicans whose ordinary attempts to build a better life, in this instance simply trying to find paying work, ended instead in one of the most brutal and highly publicized cartel killings of that year. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Just months after that video shocked the country, a different set of 5 young men would be found near a university campus in a neighboring state. Their bodies discovered, stuffed inside a car on the outskirts of a city already worn down by years of fighting between 2 rival cartels for control of the same stretch of territory. The Celaya 5. Celaya is a city in the Mexican state of Guanajuato, located in the central part of the country, a region that for most of Mexico's modern history was known more for manufacturing and agriculture than for cartel violence. That changed dramatically over the years leading up to December 2023, as Guanajuato transformed into one of the most dangerous states in the entire country, driven almost entirely by a brutal turf war between 2 competing criminal organizations fighting for control of fuel theft, extortion rackets, and drug trafficking routes running through the region. The 2 groups fighting for dominance in Guanajuato were the Santa Rosa de Lima Cartel, a smaller but extremely violent local organization, and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known widely by the initials CJNG, one of the largest and most powerful criminal networks operating anywhere in Mexico. The fight between these 2 groups had been going on for years by the time December 2023 arrived, and it had already made Guanajuato according to official Mexican homicide statistics, the most violent state in the entire country. To understand how bad the situation had become in Guanajuato by that point, it helps to look at what else had already happened in the state in the months leading up to December 2023. In June of that year, the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel set off a car bomb in Celaya, specifically targeting law enforcement, an attack that killed a National Guard officer. According to reporting on the incident, National Guard officers had responded to a tip about a suspicious car parked with what appeared to be human bodies inside it. As officers approached the vehicle to investigate, it exploded, sending several of them flying from the force of the blast. That single incident showed how far the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel was willing to go, using an apparent decoy of dead bodies to lure in law enforcement before detonating an explosive device aimed directly at killing the officers responding to the scene. The violence in Guanajuato that year was not limited to attacks on law enforcement either. Earlier that same year, in April, a woman running for mayor in the state was shot and killed in the street just as she was beginning her campaign, a killing that underscored how political figures in the region had also become direct targets of cartel violence. In June, a baby and a toddler were among 6 members of the same family murdered in the state, a detail that made clear just how far the violence had spread beyond anyone directly connected to the drug trade or law enforcement. The previous December, in 2022, 11 people were killed and another dozen wounded in an attack on a pre-Christmas party. One more example of ordinary social gatherings turning into scenes of mass violence in a state where cartel conflict had become an everyday backdrop to daily life. Given this level of ongoing violence, the United States State Department issued a formal travel advisory specifically urging Americans to reconsider traveling to Guanajuato at all. That advisory specifically flagged concern about the high number of murders occurring in the southern region of the state, tied directly to cartel-related violence. A warning aimed at American citizens who might otherwise visit the state's popular tourist destinations without realizing how dangerous certain parts of the region had become. It was within this backdrop of sustained, escalating violence that 5 young men, all described in reporting as university age, were killed and their bodies discovered in a rural area on the outskirts of Celaya. According to CBS News reporting on the case, the bodies were found on a Sunday in December 2023, stuffed inside a car in a rural area near the edge of the city, in a location described as being outside a local university. The victims were all identified in reporting simply as young men, with available public reporting not providing individual names, exact ages, or additional biographical detail about who these 5 men specifically were, beyond their approximate age range, and the fact that the location where they were found sat near a university campus. This lack of individually reported detail is itself worth noting honestly, since it reflects a broader and troubling pattern in how cartel-related killings are covered and processed in parts of Mexico experiencing the highest levels of violence. In regions like Guanajuato, where homicide rates tied to organized crime have remained extremely high for years, individual victims sometimes do not receive the same level of sustained media coverage or public identification that a single isolated killing might receive in a lower violence area. 5 deaths in a single discovery, tragic as each life lost undeniably was, became one entry among many in a much larger pattern of violence overwhelming the region that same year. And the specific personal details of these 5 young men were not as widely reported or preserved in available English language coverage as they were for some of the other cases covered in this list. What is confirmed through official statements is the reaction from local and state leadership once the bodies were discovered. Diego Sinhue Rodriguez, the governor of Guanajuato at the time, publicly pledged what he described as an exhaustive investigation into the killings. Announcements of this kind from state governors are a fairly standard response following high-profile violent crimes in Mexico, promising thorough investigation and often specifically citing coordination between state, federal, and municipal security agencies. Whether that specific pledge translated into a fully resolved investigation with named suspects or eventual convictions is not confirmed in available reporting, another honest gap that reflects how difficult it can be to track outcomes in cases like this one once the initial wave of news coverage passes. The mayor of Celaya at the time, Javier Mendoza Marquez, also spoke publicly about the killings, expressing what he described as deep regret over what had happened, writing on social media that he had instructed state security institutions to implement a thorough operation, working alongside federal and municipal agencies to reinforce security in the surrounding region known as Laja Bajío. His message specifically referred to the young men killed as jóvenes, meaning young people, and described the act of taking their lives as cowardly, language that reflected both grief and frustration at yet another mass killing striking his city during a period when Celaya had already experienced repeated cartel-related violence throughout that same year. The location where the bodies were found, described specifically as being near a local university, adds an important layer of context to understanding why this case struck such a strong nerve locally, even without individually confirmed victim details reaching wider audiences. Universities represent one of the clearest symbols of ordinary daily life and future opportunity in any community, filled with young people working toward degrees, part-time jobs, and the kind of stable future that violence like this directly threatens to take away. Finding 5 bodies near that kind of location, rather than in a more remote or clearly criminal-associated area, reinforced a growing fear among residents of Celaya and the broader Guanajuato region that no location, not even the areas surrounding schools and universities, could be considered fully safe from the ongoing cartel war consuming the state. This case did not happen in isolation. It arrived at the tail end of a year that had already produced an alarming pattern of violence, specifically tied to the ongoing fight between the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel for control of Guanajuato's territory and criminal economies. Just days after the discovery of these 5 bodies, a separate and even larger incident occurred in the nearby city of Salamanca, within the same state, when 12 bodies bearing clear signs of torture were discovered within a 2-hour window across 5 different locations throughout the city. According to the state prosecutor's office investigating that incident, the victims, 3 women and 9 men, were found on roads, bridges, and avenues throughout Salamanca, their bodies showing gunshot wounds and torture marks, with one body having been dismembered entirely. The killers in that case left messages at the scenes claiming responsibility on behalf of a specific cartel, attributing the violence directly to the ongoing disputes between organized crime groups fighting over the region. These 2 incidents occurring within the same general time frame and the same state illustrate just how saturated Guanajuato had become with cartel violence by the end of 2023. Local officials found themselves responding to one mass casualty event after another, often within the same week, each one requiring its own public statement, its own pledge of investigation, and its own attempt to reassure residents that the situation was being addressed, even as the underlying conflict between the 2 rival cartels showed no clear signs of slowing down. The broader context of the Santa Rosa de Lima versus Jalisco New Generation cartel conflict helps explain why Guanajuato specifically had become such a hotspot for this kind of violence, more so than many other Mexican states during this same period. The Santa Rosa de Lima cartel built much of its early power and revenue through a practice known as huachicoleo, a term referring to the illegal tapping of fuel pipelines to steal gasoline and diesel directly from Mexico's state-owned oil company, which the group would then resell through informal networks. This fuel theft operation generated enormous amounts of money for a relatively localized criminal organization, money that in turn allowed the group to arm itself heavily and resist encroachment from larger, better-funded rivals like the Xijing for years longer than most smaller regional cartels typically manage to survive once a group as large as Xijing sets its sights on taking over their territory. The Zheng, for its part, had spent years expanding its reach far beyond its home base in Jalisco, pushing into neighboring states, including Guanajuato, as part of a broader strategy of controlling as much territory and as many revenue streams as possible across the country. This expansion inevitably meant direct conflict with any local or regional group already operating in areas the CNG wanted to control, and Guanajuato's mix of fuel pipelines, drug trafficking routes, and extortion opportunities made it a particularly valuable target, worth fighting over, even against a determined and heavily armed local rival like Santa Rosa de Lima. Caught directly in the middle of this fight for territory and revenue were ordinary residents of Guanajuato, people with no direct connection to either cartel, who nonetheless found themselves living through car bombs, mass shootings, and repeated discoveries of tortured or executed bodies as a normal, recurring feature of life in their state. The 5 young men found near the university in Celaya represent one entry in that much larger pattern. Their deaths, another data point in a homicide statistic that had already made Guanajuato the deadliest state in the entire country by the time they were killed. Whether these 5 specific victims had any direct connection to either cartel, were caught in a case of mistaken identity similar to other cases covered throughout this list, or were simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong location at the wrong moment during an active turf war, is not confirmed through the available public reporting on this specific incident. This uncertainty itself reflects an important and uncomfortable truth about covering cartel violence in regions experiencing the highest levels of conflict in Mexico. Not every case receives the same depth of investigative reporting, individual victim profiles, or eventual public resolution that higher-profile cases, like the disappearance of the Ayotzinapa students or the viral video capturing the deaths of the 5 friends from Lagos de Moreno, eventually receive. Sometimes the full picture of who exactly was killed, why they specifically were targeted, and what ultimately happened to those responsible for the crime simply never reaches a wider audience, even when local officials publicly pledge thorough investigations at the time. What remains clear and fully confirmed through official statements and news reporting is the basic sequence of events. 5 young men, described as university age, were killed, and their bodies were discovered stuffed inside a car in a rural area on the outskirts of Celaya, near a local university, in December 2023. This discovery came during a year already marked by a car bombing that killed a National Guard officer, the shooting death of a mayoral candidate, the murder of 6 members of one family, including a baby and a toddler, and an attack on a Christmas party that killed 11 people, all within the same state, all tied to the same underlying conflict between the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, fighting for control over Guanajuato's territory and criminal profits. The governor of Guanajuato publicly promised a thorough investigation into the killings, and the mayor of Celaya expressed regret and pledged additional security measures for the surrounding region, responses that fit a now familiar pattern for local Mexican officials responding to yet another mass casualty event tied to organized crime. For the families of the 5 young men, and for a university community left to process the discovery of bodies so close to their own campus, the promises of investigation and increased security offered little comfort against the reality that Guanajuato, by the end of 2023, had become a state where violence like this had stopped being shocking and had instead become an almost expected feature of daily life for anyone living within its borders. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Just over a year later, a different group of friends heading out for what looked like an ordinary vacation would vanish along a stretch of highway hundreds of miles away, and what searchers found beside that road would include a detail so specific to cartel violence that investigators knew almost immediately what they were dealing with. The Oaxaca-Puebla 9. The border between the Mexican states of Puebla and Oaxaca cuts through a stretch of highway country that has become increasingly associated with organized crime violence over the past several years. This is not one of the border regions most Americans think of when they picture cartel territory, since it sits deep in the interior of Mexico rather than along the line separating Mexico from the United States. But the area has its own history of criminal organizations fighting for control over drug trafficking routes, extortion rackets, and local territory. One of the groups tied to that history is known as Los Zacapoaxtlas, a criminal organization that has operated in the Puebla region for years, often in competition with other groups trying to establish control over the same stretch of territory. In February 2025, a group of friends set out on what appeared to be an ordinary vacation. According to information gathered by investigators and later reported by news outlets, the group included Angie Lizeth Perez Garcia, who was reported missing from the town of Santa Maria Huatulco in Oaxaca on February 28th, and Leslie Noya Trejo, who was reported missing that same day from San Pedro Pochutla, also in Oaxaca. Other individuals connected to the group and reported missing around the same time were identified only partially in initial reporting, using first names and last initials rather than full names, including Brenda Mariel, Jacqueline Ailit, Noemi Yamileth, Raul Emmanuel, Ruben Antonio, and Rolando Armando. This partial identification reflects standard practice in ongoing Mexican investigations, where full names are sometimes withheld, either at the request of families or due to the early stage of confirming identities through official channels. Surveillance footage recovered during the investigation captured what would become the last confirmed sighting of the group. The footage showed the friends driving along the Atlixcayotl Highway near the town of Atlixco, located in Puebla State, on February 24, 2025. This was several days before the formal missing persons reports were filed by family members in Oaxaca, suggesting that the group had been out of contact with loved ones for some time before anyone raised the alarm, a detail that is fairly common in cases where a group of friends travels together and family members do not expect regular check-ins during a vacation. After that sighting, the group vanished. What happened to them over the following days remains one of the less publicly documented gaps in this particular case, since available reporting does not provide detailed information about their movements or condition during the period between the last surveillance sighting and the eventual discovery of their remains. This kind of information gap is common in cases where victims are held captive for a period of time before being killed, since witnesses to that period, if any exist, are often reluctant to come forward, given the obvious danger involved in speaking publicly about organized crime activity in the region. On a Sunday in early March 2025, the remains connected to this case were discovered beside a highway in the town of San Jose Miahuatlan, a location sitting near the border between Puebla and Oaxaca states, roughly 90 miles east of where the group had last been seen on camera near Atlixco. The discovery was made inside and around an abandoned vehicle. According to local Mexican media outlets, El Financiero and Periódico Central, whose reporting was picked up by international outlets including Newsweek, the remains found at the scene were covered by a tarp that showed visible blood staining, and investigators recovered at least 9 dismembered bodies from the immediate area in and around the car. Alongside the human remains, Investigators also found a bag containing 8 pairs of severed hands. This specific detail, the deliberate separation and collection of hands from victims, is a method that has shown up in cartel violence in Mexico before, often used either as a way to prevent fingerprint-based identification of victims or as an additional layer of intimidation meant to send a message to rival groups or to the broader community about the consequences of crossing whoever was responsible for the killings. According to local reporting on the discovery, Mexican cartels have specifically become associated with this practice of removing hands from victims in a number of prior incidents, making this detail, while horrifying on its own, unfortunately consistent with a broader pattern already documented in other cartel-related crime scenes across the country. The bodies discovered at the scene showed signs of both gunshot wounds and torture, according to local reporting based on statements from investigators who examined the remains. The combination of these two things, bullet wounds alongside evidence of torture inflicted before death, indicated that whoever carried out these killings had held the victims for some period of time and subjected them to violence beyond what would have been necessary simply to kill them, a pattern consistent with cartel violence intended to extract information, punish perceived betrayal, or simply terrorize victims before their deaths as a form of message sending to anyone who might eventually learn what had happened. Idamis Pastor Betancourt, who headed Puebla's State Attorney General's office at the time, addressed the case publicly but offered limited details when questioned by reporters. According to her public statement, she said she was not able to offer specific information about the investigation at that time, explaining that there were active lines of investigation being pursued, but that she could not reveal them due to confidentiality requirements tied to the ongoing case. This kind of limited public statement is fairly standard practice for Mexican officials handling active investigations into organized crime violence, since revealing too much information publicly can sometimes compromise evidence gathering or put investigators and witnesses at additional risk, though it also means that families and the broader public are often left without clear answers for extended periods of time while investigations continue behind closed doors. One detail connected to the timing of this discovery adds an important piece of context to understanding the broader situation in the region at the time. The remains were found on the same day that a man identified as Jose Alfredo, who went by the nickname El Hocha, and who authorities identified as the alleged leader of the Los Zacapoaxtlas criminal organization, was shot and killed. Whether these two events, the discovery of the 9 dismembered bodies and the killing of a major criminal leader from a group operating in the same general region, were directly connected to each other, has not been officially confirmed in available reporting. However, the timing itself is notable, since violent power struggles within or between criminal organizations often produce exactly this kind of overlapping pattern, where the elimination of a rival group's members and the killing of a leader from a competing organization can happen within a short window of each other as territory disputes escalate or as one group seeks to demonstrate strength during a period of instability. Authorities investigating the case had not, according to available reporting at the time these details were published, formally confirmed that the discovery of the 9 bodies was directly tied to cartel activity, even though the manner in which the victims were killed strongly suggested organized crime involvement to anyone familiar with how these kinds of crime scenes typically look in this part of Mexico. This distinction matters for the sake of accuracy. Cartel violence in Mexico is often identified through a recognizable set of patterns, including mass executions, dismemberment, and the deliberate targeting of large groups of victims at once, tactics that criminal organizations have used repeatedly to assert power and instill fear in rival groups and in the general population. The specific combination of details in this case, the number of victims, the method of dismemberment, the removal of hands, and the signs of torture prior to death, all matched patterns closely associated with organized crime activity in Mexico, even without an official confirmation naming a specific cartel as responsible. It is worth placing this case within the broader statistical context of violence in Mexico during this general period, based on national data available at the time. According to preliminary national statistics for 2023, the most recent complete data available when some of this reporting was published, Mexico recorded 31,062 homicides that year, a decline of about 6.7% compared to the 33,287 homicides recorded the year before, in 2022. This decline in national homicide statistics represented the lowest overall level recorded since 2016, according to Mexico's National Statistics Agency. That broader national trend towards slightly fewer homicides overall did not mean that specific regions and specific criminal organizations had stopped carrying out exactly this kind of mass casualty violence, since national averages can mask significant variation between different states and regions, some of which, like the border area between Puebla and Oaxaca where these 9 victims were found, continued to experience serious organized crime violence even as the country's overall homicide numbers were trending slightly downward. The specific group of friends whose remains were found in this case appear, based on available reporting, to have simply been traveling together, likely on a personal trip, given the description of them as vacationing, without any confirmed direct connection to organized crime activity themselves. This detail, if accurate based on available reporting, would place this case within a troubling pattern that has repeated across several of the incidents covered throughout this list, where ordinary young people traveling, working on projects, or simply going about daily activities that have nothing to do with organized crime find themselves killed, either through mistaken identity, being caught in contested territory at the wrong moment, or being targeted for reasons that may never be fully explained to the public, or even to their own grieving families. The uncertainty surrounding several key aspects of this particular case, including the exact circumstances that led to the group's abduction, the specific timeline of what happened to them between their last sighting on February 24th and the discovery of their remains roughly a week later, and the official confirmation of which criminal organization, if any, was directly responsible, reflects an important and uncomfortable reality about covering ongoing cartel violence in Mexico. Not every case receives the same depth of sustained investigation, media coverage, or eventual public resolution, even when the physical evidence recovered strongly suggests organized crime involvement based on well-established patterns seen repeatedly across other confirmed cartel violence cases throughout the country. For the families of Angie Lizeth Perez Garcia, Leslie Noya Trejo, and the other friends who were part of this group, the confirmation of their deaths came without the kind of full public accounting that some other high-profile cartel violence cases have eventually received. There was no viral video forcing national attention onto the case, the way there was with the 5 friends killed in Lagos de Moreno. There was no international director using a public platform to draw global attention to their disappearance, the way Guillermo del Toro did for the 3 film students killed in Jalisco. Instead, their case moved through local Mexican news coverage, picked up by a handful of international outlets summarizing the discovery, and then largely faded from broader public attention as other news events took its place. A pattern that repeats itself constantly across Mexico's ongoing struggle with cartel violence, where the sheer volume of similar incidents makes it difficult for any single case, no matter how horrifying the details, to hold sustained national or international attention for very long. What remains confirmed and consistent across the available reporting on this case is the basic sequence of events. A group of friends on a vacation trip were last seen together on surveillance footage on February 24th, 2025, driving along a highway in Puebla State. Family members in Oaxaca reported them missing several days later, at the end of February. In early March, 9 dismembered bodies, along with a bag containing 8 pairs of severed hands, were discovered beside a highway roughly 90 miles from where the group had last been seen, inside and around an abandoned vehicle covered by a blood-stained tarp. The remains showed signs of both gunshot wounds and torture. The discovery came on the same day that a regional cartel leader, identified as El Hocha, was shot and killed, though no official connection between these two events has been confirmed publicly. Puebla state officials acknowledged the investigation was ongoing, but declined to release specific details, citing confidentiality requirements tied to active lines of investigation. This case, more than several others covered throughout this list, illustrates just how much cartel violence in certain regions of Mexico has become normalized to the point where even mass casualty events involving 9 victims at once can move through the news cycle relatively quickly, generating regional coverage and a handful of international summaries before public attention shifts elsewhere. For families living in these affected regions, that reality does not make the loss of a loved one any less devastating. But it does mean that many cases like this one never receive the kind of sustained scrutiny, formal accountability, or eventual closure that other cases on this list, driven by viral footage, international celebrity attention, or years of persistent activism from grieving families, have managed to achieve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years before 9 friends disappeared, along that same stretch of highway country, a doctoral student, thousands of miles from home, would head out into a remote stretch of desert for what was supposed to be routine scientific fieldwork, and the mystery behind why he never made it back would leave investigators debating whether his death had anything to do with science. Gabriel Trujillo. Gabriel Trujillo grew up with a deep interest in the natural world, a passion that would eventually shape both his education and his career path. By his early 30s, he had built a life centered around science, research, and a genuine love for plants and the outdoors, the kind of quiet, focused dedication that rarely makes headlines on its own, but forms the backbone of countless research projects carried out at universities across the country every year. He was working toward his doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the top research universities in the United States, and his specific area of study involved plant research, including work related to a plant known as buttonbush. Fieldwork like this is a normal and often necessary part of earning a doctorate in the sciences. Unlike research that can be done entirely in a lab or through analyzing existing data, studying plants in their natural environment often requires researchers to travel to the specific regions where those plants grow, sometimes for extended stretches of time, in order to observe growth patterns, collect samples, and gather the kind of first-hand data that cannot be replicated any other way. For Gabriel, this meant traveling south, into a part of Mexico known as Sonora, a state that borders Arizona and sits along a stretch of desert landscape that has long been of interest to botanists and ecologists studying plant life adapted to harsh, dry conditions. In July 2023, Gabriel made the trip into Sonora for his research. He was accompanied on this journey by his fiancée, a woman named Roxanne Cruz de Hoyas, known to the people close to her by the nickname Roxy. According to his obituary, Gabriel had a passion for both nature and culture, along with what those who knew him described as a relentless drive for science. He was someone who found genuine comfort and meaning in the outdoors, someone who was, according to his own obituary, always eager to learn more about the natural world and to protect the environment he cared about so deeply. This was not someone chasing a quick research trip for the sake of finishing a requirement. This was someone who had built his entire academic identity around a real love for the subject he was studying. What Gabriel likely did not fully grasp, or perhaps underestimated, was just how dangerous the specific area of Sonora he was traveling through had become by the summer of 2023. The region he was working in sat within territory where multiple criminal organizations were actively competing for control, and the situation on the ground had grown significantly more chaotic and violent in the years leading up to his trip. To understand why this particular stretch of Sonora had become so dangerous, it helps to look at the broader criminal landscape in the region at the time. Historically, the area had been under the control of the Sinaloa Cartel, the organization once led by Joaquin Guzman, better known as El Chapo. During Guzman's time running the cartel, he had allowed two separate factions to operate somewhat side by side within Sonora: the main Sinaloa cartel structure and a smaller allied group known as the Caborca Cartel. This arrangement, while not without its own tensions, had provided a degree of relative order to how criminal activity was organized in the region for a period of time. By 2023, that arrangement had broken down. Rather than one or two organizations maintaining relatively stable control, the region had fractured into a fight involving at least three separate cartels, including two competing factions that had splintered out of the original Sinaloa cartel structure, along with growing pressure from the Jalisco New Generation cartel, which had been expanding aggressively into new territory across various parts of Mexico. According to reporting on the security situation at the time, this fracturing had resulted in a documented 518 homicides in the state through the month of May alone that year, a staggering number that reflected just how much more violent and unpredictable the region had become as multiple armed groups fought over the same territory at once. A security expert who specializes in kidnapping cases around the world and who has direct experience dealing with crime in Mexico described the situation to reporters in blunt terms following Gabriel's death. He explained that instead of a single cartel patrolling the area, as had been more common in the past, the region now had a minimum of 3 separate cartels patrolling the same space, actively fighting each other while also looking out for anyone who might pose a threat or an opportunity within their contested territory. According to this expert, Gabriel had effectively walked into what he described as a war zone at about the worst possible time, given how unstable and violent the area had become compared to previous years when a more established, single cartel presence had at least provided some degree of predictability, even if that predictability came with its own dangers. On the day Gabriel was killed, he had been out in a remote area, conducting his field research, working alone in a section of desert landscape, studying the plant life he had traveled there specifically to observe. According to reporting on the case, he was shot and killed while out in this remote setting, with reports indicating he was shot multiple times, specifically described in some reporting as being shot 7 times. His body was left inside his own SUV at the scene. The specific details of how his body and vehicle were left behind became an important clue that investigators and outside security experts used to try to understand what had actually happened and why. The same kidnapping and security expert who spoke to reporters about the broader cartel situation in the region also offered his own analysis of these specific details, describing them as unusual in a way that pointed toward a particular theory about what might have happened. According to this expert's analysis, the fact that Gabriel's body was left inside his vehicle, rather than being removed from the vehicle and dumped elsewhere, along with the fact that his body did not appear to have been mutilated in the kind of theatrical, message-sending way that cartels in Mexico often use specifically to warn rival groups, suggested something different than a typical cartel execution aimed at intimidation. He also pointed out that the vehicle itself, an SUV, was the exact kind of vehicle that cartel operatives in the region commonly use for their own operations, yet it had been left behind entirely rather than stolen, something that struck him as notable given how valuable that type of vehicle would normally be to armed groups operating in a remote desert region far from any kind of formal law enforcement presence. Based on these specific details, the security expert offered a theory to explain what might have happened. He suggested that whoever killed Gabriel may have believed, incorrectly, that he was an undercover agent working for the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, commonly known as the DEA. His reasoning centered on the idea that if the shooters had genuinely believed Gabriel was simply a random civilian or someone connected to a rival criminal organization, they likely would have handled the scene differently, either stealing the vehicle for their own use or mutilating the body in the kind of way that criminal organizations in this region have used repeatedly to send warnings to rivals or to the public. He explained his reasoning by putting himself directly in the position of a hired gunman patrolling a remote, contested stretch of territory in the middle of nowhere, roughly 65 miles from the border with the United States. From that perspective, encountering an unfamiliar man out in the desert, moving around in the brush with American license plates on his vehicle, doing something that might look unfamiliar or suspicious to someone without any scientific background, created exactly the kind of situation where a nervous or suspicious gunman might jump to the conclusion that they had stumbled upon undercover surveillance rather than a university researcher collecting plant samples. According to the expert, even if Gabriel had tried to explain to anyone who confronted him that he was simply there doing plant research, someone already primed to suspect infiltration by American law enforcement might not have believed that explanation, especially in a moment of tension out in a remote area with little opportunity for a calm, extended conversation. It is important to be direct and honest about exactly how confirmed this specific theory is. This explanation for why Gabriel was killed comes from the analysis and professional judgment of an outside security expert speaking to reporters after the fact, based on the physical details left at the scene and his own extensive experience with how cartels typically operate in that specific region. It is not a confirmed motive established through an arrest, a formal confession, or a court proceeding. As of the reporting available on this case, no official update had been issued confirming exactly who was responsible for Gabriel's death or exactly why he was targeted. The same reporting on the case noted that the expert had made calls to independent sources within the area following the killing, and those sources indicated that one of the cartels operating in the region was believed to be responsible, though even those sources could not say definitively which specific group had carried out the killing or precisely why. This distinction matters for the sake of accuracy. The broader facts of Gabriel's death, that he was a doctoral student conducting legitimate field research, that he was killed while alone in a remote part of Sonora known to be actively contested by multiple cartels, that he was shot multiple times and left inside his vehicle, and that the region was experiencing an unusually high level of violence and instability at the time, due to the fracturing of what had previously been a more unified criminal presence, are all well documented through reporting on the case. The specific explanation for why he was targeted, the theory that gunmen mistook him for an undercover DEA operative, remains an informed theory from a security expert rather than a confirmed fact established through investigation or prosecution. News of Gabriel's death spread through both academic circles and broader news coverage once details of the killing became public. For a university community like UC Berkeley, the loss of a doctoral student under these circumstances, someone actively engaged in legitimate academic research rather than any kind of risky personal travel, struck a particular kind of nerve, since it highlighted just how dangerous certain regions of Mexico had become, even for researchers whose work had nothing whatsoever to do with the drug trade or organized crime. Gabriel's fiancée, Roxanne Cruz de Hoyas, had been with him during the broader trip, and according to details shared publicly after his death, it reportedly took her days to locate him once it became clear something had gone wrong. This detail underscores just how remote and difficult to access the specific area where Gabriel had been conducting his fieldwork actually was. A place isolated enough that even someone actively searching for a missing loved one faced significant delays before locating him. Friends and family who spoke publicly about Gabriel after his death consistently described someone deeply devoted both to his academic work and to the people close to him. A close friend of his fiancée, posting a tribute under the name Brigitte on social media, wrote about the calming and grounding presence Gabriel brought into the lives of people around him, describing how his gentleness and his steady presence reminded people to approach each other with calm, curiosity, and kindness. The same tribute described the life Gabriel and Roxanne had built together as an inspiration for building a better world, language that reflected the depth of loss felt not just by his immediate family, but by a wider circle of friends and colleagues who had come to know him through his work and his personality. Gabriel's death also fits into a broader and troubling pattern that has become increasingly documented across parts of Mexico experiencing significant cartel fragmentation and territorial conflict. As larger, more established criminal organizations break apart into smaller, competing factions, often following the arrest or death of a major cartel leader, the resulting instability tends to make entire regions less predictable and, in many cases, significantly more dangerous for anyone passing through, regardless of whether that person has any actual connection to criminal activity. Multiple competing groups operating in the same territory, each nervous about infiltration by rivals or by law enforcement, can create exactly the kind of tense, trigger-ready environment where an ordinary traveler, in this case a scientist, doing legitimate academic fieldwork, can be misidentified as a threat and killed as a result, even without any deliberate intent to specifically target a researcher rather than someone actually connected to organized crime or law enforcement. This pattern reflects one of the more difficult truths about how instability within Mexico's cartel landscape can create danger even for people who have taken no risks beyond simply traveling to a region for entirely legitimate professional reasons. Gabriel was not engaged in anything resembling activity that most people would consider risky under normal circumstances. He was doing exactly what thousands of graduate students conducting field-based research do every year, traveling to a specific location to study the subject of his dissertation directly in its natural environment. The specific combination of factors present in Sonora at that particular moment, a fractured and increasingly paranoid cartel landscape, a remote location far from any meaningful security presence, and, according to at least one expert's informed theory, an unfortunate set of circumstances that made him appear suspicious to armed men patrolling that isolated stretch of desert, turned an otherwise routine research trip into a fatal one. For Gabriel's family, friends, and the academic community at UC Berkeley who lost him, the lack of a fully confirmed motive or resolved investigation likely does little to ease the weight of his death. What remains clear, regardless of the exact reasoning behind why he specifically was targeted, is that a promising doctoral student with a genuine passion for plant science and the natural world traveled to Mexico to do the kind of fieldwork his degree required, and he never made it home. His case stands as a sobering reminder that cartel violence in Mexico does not always require a victim to have any connection whatsoever to organized crime, gang activity, or criminal behavior of any kind. Sometimes, as the available evidence in Gabriel's case suggests, simply being in the wrong isolated location during a period of intense and unpredictable territorial conflict between rival criminal groups is enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After this case, the story moves to a group of young people in Veracruz who were stopped by police at a gas station and handed directly to a criminal organization, a case that helped expose just how deep the ties between local police and cartels had grown in parts of Mexico. The San Fernando Bus Massacre. San Fernando is a small municipality in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, sitting almost directly between four major cities that have all played a role in Mexico's drug war: Monterrey, Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and Matamoros. Local reporters at the time described the roads running through San Fernando as a virtual spiderweb, a tangle of dirt roads connecting all four of those cities to each other. That geography made San Fernando extremely valuable to any criminal organization trying to control the movement of drugs, money, and people through the region. And it also made the town a natural choke point for controlling one of the most important stretches of highway in northeastern Mexico, Federal Highway 101. By 2011, San Fernando sat in the middle of a brutal war between two criminal organizations that had once worked together. Los Zetas had started out as the armed enforcement wing of the Gulf Cartel, made up largely of former Mexican Special Forces soldiers recruited specifically for their military training. At some point around 2010, that partnership broke apart, and the two groups turned their weapons on each other. The fighting started in Reynosa and quickly spread outward, first to Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros, then further into Tamaulipas and the neighboring states of Nuevo León and Veracruz. Local authorities and media outlets initially tried to downplay how serious the situation had gotten, but the fighting made that impossible to hide for very long. Entire cities were being paralyzed by open gun battles in broad daylight. Residents described whole municipalities turning into what they called war zones, with businesses and homes burned to the ground and areas left in what one witness called total destruction. The Gulf Cartel, under a leader named Antonio Cardenas Guillén, made a specific push to attack Los Zetas directly in their stronghold around San Fernando. Whoever controlled this stretch of highway country controlled a critical piece of the smuggling routes running toward the Texas border, and both sides were willing to do almost anything to hold on to it. It was in this environment, a town already gripped by cartel warfare and sitting along one of the most contested highway corridors in the country, that a massacre began to unfold over a period of roughly 2 months in the spring of 2011. Between March 24th and March 29th, 2011, several public passenger buses traveling toward Reynosa were hijacked as they passed through San Fernando. Passenger buses are an extremely common way to travel long distances in Mexico, used by ordinary people for all kinds of reasons: visiting family, traveling for work, heading to school, or simply getting from one city to another when a car isn't available. For years, buses running this particular stretch of highway had carried exactly that kind of routine traffic. What happened to the buses hijacked during this stretch of days in March 2011 turned an ordinary form of transportation into a death trap. According to testimony later given by a cartel member on trial in Laredo, Texas, the operation was directly ordered by a high-ranking Zeta lieutenant named Miguel Trevino Morales. Trevino Morales was known within Los Zetas for his extreme brutality, and according to that same courtroom testimony, he specifically ordered fighting contests between kidnapped victims as a way to make his own men, particularly new recruits, lose their fear of killing. The same testimony indicated that around this time, the organization was actively training around 100 new recruits in the state capital, Ciudad Victoria, with another 300 being trained in San Fernando itself, meaning the group had an urgent need to condition large numbers of new members to commit violence without hesitation. The scale of what was happening did not become clear right away. The first sign that something had gone seriously wrong came from an unusual source: unclaimed baggage. Investigators began to notice that suitcases and other luggage belonging to bus passengers were going unclaimed in the nearby cities of Reynosa and Matamoros, the destinations those hijacked buses had been heading toward. People who should have arrived to pick up their belongings simply never showed up, and as more and more of this luggage piled up without anyone coming to collect it, authorities started to realize that entire busloads of people had likely vanished somewhere along that stretch of highway. On April 6, 2011, Mexican authorities acted on this information and began digging in the area around San Fernando. That first search uncovered 59 bodies spread across 8 separate clandestine mass graves. This discovery alone would have been a staggering crime scene on its own, but it turned out to be only the beginning. Investigators continued digging in the weeks that followed, and the number of exhumed bodies kept climbing. By April 8th, officials confirmed 13 additional bodies had been found, bringing the total at that point to 72. The digging did not stop there. Search teams kept uncovering more graves scattered across the area, and by June 7, 2011, after a series of separate excavations, the total number of bodies pulled from the ground around San Fernando reached 193 people, buried across 47 separate clandestine graves. The method used to kill many of the victims reflected the same brutal logic that Trevino Morales had reportedly ordered when Ho set up the operation in the first place. According to testimony gathered from captured cartel members, kidnapped victims, specifically male passengers who were considered able-bodied, were forced to fight to the death against each other. They were given weapons that had nothing to do with a typical execution: knives, hammers, machetes, and clubs. Female passengers who were kidnapped during these bus hijackings were reported to have been raped during their captivity. According to investigators, piecing together what had happened based on evidence and witness accounts gathered during the excavation process, this method of forcing captives to kill one another, rather than simply executing them directly, served a specific purpose for Los Zetas, beyond just eliminating people the group viewed as threats or obstacles. Forcing new or unproven members of the organization to participate in this kind of violence, as Trevino Morales reportedly intended, worked as a brutal form of conditioning, training recruits to overcome any hesitation about killing by making them do it with their own hands, using crude weapons, against other human beings who had done nothing except happen to be traveling on the wrong bus at the wrong time. 14 suspected cartel members were arrested in connection with the case as the investigation into the graves continued. Mexican President Felipe Calderón addressed the massacre publicly through social media, at the time still a relatively new tool for political leaders to use for immediate public statements, posting that he was sending his deepest condolences and that he strongly condemned what had happened. That same night, the president's office released a formal communiqué describing the killings as a direct result of the ongoing war between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, the two rival organizations fighting for control of Tamaulipas at the time. The physical toll the ongoing violence took on the surrounding area extended well beyond the specific victims found in those mass graves. Bus companies operating routes through Tamaulipas actually stopped taking passengers to San Fernando entirely once the situation became clear, refusing to run that route until authorities could get some kind of handle on what was happening. Local residents who had lived through the worst of the fighting described Highway 101, the same road these hijacked buses had been traveling on, using a grim nickname that stuck for years afterward: the Highway of Death. People who traveled that stretch of road during 2010 and 2011 described routinely seeing burned-out vehicles, trucks riddled with bullet holes abandoned on the shoulder, and dead bodies left behind in plain sight, often decapitated, a level of open, visible violence that turned an ordinary highway into something closer to a war zone that civilians still had to somehow navigate through in order to travel between cities. This case, as horrifying as it was, sits differently on this list than most of the other cases covered so far, and it is worth being completely honest about that difference, rather than smoothing it over. Every other case in this list centers on victims who were specifically and individually confirmed to be students, whether that meant a named college student, like Mark Kilroy, a named group of film students in Guadalajara, or teenagers and young adults at a house party made up largely of high school and university students in Ciudad Juarez. The 193 victims pulled from the ground around San Fernando were passengers on hijacked commercial buses traveling a well-used highway route. Based on available reporting and investigative records connected to this case, these passengers came from a wide range of backgrounds and ages, and the surviving public reporting on the massacre does not provide a confirmed breakdown of how many, if any, of the 193 victims were specifically enrolled college or university students at the time they were killed. Given how commonly students, especially those without cars of their own, rely on exactly this kind of long-distance passenger bus travel to get around Mexico, it is entirely plausible, even likely, that some number of the 193 people killed in this massacre were college students traveling that route for entirely ordinary reasons, whether heading home for a break, traveling to visit family, or making their way to a job or an internship. However, plausible is not the same as confirmed, and this case is being included on this list with that distinction stated clearly rather than assumed away for the sake of a cleaner narrative. What is fully confirmed, without any need for a caveat, is that 193 innocent people, travelers with no connection to either cartel, were murdered in one of the most brutal ways documented anywhere during Mexico's drug war, specifically because Los Zetas needed to condition new recruits to kill without hesitation and needed a captive, defenseless population to use for that purpose. The broader impact of the San Fernando massacre reached well beyond the immediate horror of the death toll itself. This case, more than almost any other single incident up to that point in Mexico's drug war, exposed just how far criminal organizations were willing to go in treating ordinary civilians as disposable tools for their own internal training and discipline. It was not enough for Los Zetas to simply eliminate people they viewed as threats or witnesses to their operations. They specifically sought out defenseless captives whose only connection to the conflict was the misfortune of boarding the wrong bus, and used those captives as training exercises for their own violence, a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even a country that had already witnessed years of escalating cartel brutality by that point. The scale of the discovery also forced a broader reckoning with just how much of northeastern Mexico had effectively become ungoverned territory during this period, with entire highway corridors serving as hunting grounds for organized crime, and with local and even federal authorities struggling to locate mass graves containing nearly 200 bodies until unclaimed luggage tipped them off almost by accident. The massacre remains, based on the number of confirmed victims recovered from a single set of connected graves, one of the largest documented mass killings of Mexico's modern drug war, a grim marker of just how violent the fight between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel had become by the spring of 2011. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 6 years after searchers finished pulling the last of those 193 bodies from the ground around San Fernando, a very different kind of case would emerge in the neighboring state of Veracruz, one that started not with a hijacked bus, but with a routine traffic stop, and would end up exposing just how directly local police in parts of Mexico were working hand in hand with the same kind of criminal organizations responsible for massacres like this one. The Tierra Blanca 5. Tierra Blanca is a municipality in the Mexican state of Veracruz, a state that sits along the Gulf of Mexico and has spent years dealing with serious organized crime violence, tied primarily to Los Zetas, the same criminal organization responsible for other mass casualty events covered elsewhere in this list, including the San Fernando bus massacre just across the state line in Tamaulipas. By the mid-2010s, Veracruz had developed a well-documented and deeply troubling problem specific to how its state and local police forces operated. Human rights organizations and journalists covering the region had spent years raising concerns about how deeply criminal organizations had infiltrated local law enforcement, to the point where police officers themselves were sometimes acting less like protectors of public safety and more like an extension of the criminal groups they were supposed to be fighting. On January 11, 2017, 5 young people were driving back from a trip to the beach. According to information later provided by the Veracruz State Attorney General at the time, Luis Ángel Bravo Contreras, the group was pulled over by police at a gas station in Tierra Blanca. The reported reason for the stop was speeding, an extremely ordinary traffic violation, the kind of stop that happens to drivers all over the world every single day without leading to anything more serious than a ticket or a warning. The group included 1 teenage girl and 4 young men, all of them heading home after what had been, up to that point, a normal weekend getaway. Instead of receiving a ticket and continuing on their way, the 5 were detained by the officers who stopped them. What happened over the following hours became the center of the entire case. According to the account given by the State Attorney General, the police officers who detained the group did not release them, charge them with a crime, or bring them to a police station to be processed through any kind of normal legal procedure. Instead, according to Bravo Contreras, the officers handed the 5 young people directly over to a criminal organization. The specific name of that organization was not confirmed in the reporting available on the case, with official statements at the time referring to it only as an unnamed criminal group operating in the area. From the moment they were handed over, the 5 vanished. There was no ransom demand. There was no further contact with their families. There was simply silence, the same kind of sudden, unexplained silence that has marked the beginning of so many other disappearances connected to organized crime violence across Mexico over the past 2 decades. For the families of the missing 5, the nightmare began with a routine worry that most parents can immediately understand and dread. Their children had not come home from a weekend trip. Phone calls went unanswered. As hours turned into a full day without any contact, that ordinary parental worry escalated quickly into something far more serious. When family members eventually pieced together what had happened, learning that their children had last been seen in police custody rather than simply lost or delayed somewhere on the road home, that shift transformed their search from a private family concern into a case implicating the very officers who were supposed to protect the public. One father of one of the missing youths spoke to the Mexican news outlet Animal Politico as the search intensified, and his statement captured the specific and painful distrust that families in this situation were forced to confront. He said plainly that his family did not trust the authorities in Veracruz at all. This was not an abstract political statement made for the sake of criticizing the government in general terms. It was a direct, personal reaction from a parent who had just learned that his own child had disappeared, not despite the presence of police, but specifically because of what police officers themselves had allegedly done. The search for the 5 missing youths grew quickly once the details of their disappearance became public, and once state officials acknowledged the apparent involvement of their own police force. According to reporting on the case, roughly 140 state and federal officers were assigned to search for the missing group in the days following their disappearance. This was a significant deployment of manpower for a search involving 5 people, reflecting both the seriousness with which the case was eventually treated once police involvement came to light, and the intense public pressure building around a story that touched a nerve reaching back to one of the most infamous cases in recent Mexican history. That comparison was not something people had to search hard to find. Mexico had already lived through the disappearance of the Ayotzinapa 43 back in 2014, a case built around the same basic pattern: local police detaining a group of young people and then handing them directly to a criminal organization rather than following any legitimate legal process. Reporting on the Tierra Blanca case at the time directly acknowledged this parallel, noting that Veracruz like the state of Guerrero, where the Ayotzinapa disappearance took place, was already known to be plagued by violence connected to criminal gangs, with Los Zetas identified as the strongest and most dangerous of those groups operating in the region. The suggestion that state police in Veracruz might be collaborating with those same criminal gangs, as the early investigation into the Tierra Blanca case seemed to indicate, was described at the time as an entirely plausible scenario, given everything already known about how deeply organized crime had embedded itself into local law enforcement across that part of Mexico. As the investigation continued, control over the case shifted from local Veracruz authorities to the federal level. On January 18, 2017, just 1 week after the group disappeared, Mexico's Federal Attorney General's office, known by its Spanish acronym PGR, formally assumed control of the investigation from the state of Veracruz. This kind of jurisdictional shift, moving a case from state to federal control, generally signals that officials at the highest levels of Mexican law enforcement viewed the case as serious enough, or the local authorities as untrustworthy enough, to require direct federal oversight rather than leaving the investigation solely in the hands of the same state government whose own police force stood accused of handing the victims over to criminal actors in the first place. Physical evidence connected to the case emerged within the first few days of the search. According to reporting from Telesur, a vehicle matching the description of the one the 5 young people had been driving was located in a neighboring town not long after their disappearance. Investigators indicated that the vehicle would be subjected to forensic testing, a standard step meant to determine whether physical evidence inside or on the vehicle could offer any clues about what had happened to its occupants after they were taken into custody at that gas station. Beyond the discovery of the vehicle, publicly available reporting on this specific case does not provide additional confirmed details about what investigators ultimately found, whether any remains were eventually recovered, whether any officers or criminal organization members were formally charged or convicted in connection with the disappearance, or what the final resolution of the case turned out to be. This is an important gap to acknowledge honestly, rather than filling in with speculation. Cases like this one, involving alleged police collusion with organized crime in regions already known for corruption and violence, frequently struggle to reach a fully resolved, publicly documented conclusion for many of the same reasons that have made cases like the Ayotzinapa disappearance so difficult to fully close, even years after they occurred. Investigating police officers for collaborating with the very criminal organizations that may still hold significant power and influence over the same police department carries obvious and serious risks, both for the investigators involved and for any witnesses willing to come forward with information. What is documented clearly through available reporting is the broader pattern this case fits into regarding law enforcement and organized crime collusion, specifically within Veracruz during this period. Human rights organizations tracking enforced disappearances in the state have compiled records showing that the Tierra Blanca case was not an isolated incident. According to documentation connected to a separate but related case, families of people who had gone missing years earlier in a different Veracruz town called Actopan pointed specifically to what they learned about state police involvement in the Tierra Blanca disappearance as a reason to demand that authorities reopen investigations into their own long, unresolved cases. That earlier case involved the disappearance of 20 people from the town of Potrero Nuevo, and by early 2016, roughly a year before the Tierra Blanca disappearance occurred, families connected to that older case had already filed complaints with Veracruz's State Attorney General covering 14 separate missing persons, later escalating those complaints to the Federal Attorney General's office as well. This pattern, families of previous disappearance victims using a new case involving confirmed police involvement to push for renewed attention on their own unresolved cases, reflects just how widespread and persistent the problem of enforced disappearances tied to police and cartel collusion had become across Veracruz during this period. The Tierra Blanca case did not exist in isolation. It was one visible, publicly reported example within a much larger and largely unresolved pattern of missing persons cases stretching across the state, many of which involved similar allegations connecting local police directly to the criminal organizations responsible for the disappearances. Understanding why Veracruz, specifically, had developed this kind of deep, systemic corruption problem within its police forces requires looking at the broader security situation in the state during the years leading up to 2017. Los Zetas had established a strong and violent presence across large parts of Veracruz, competing at various points with other criminal organizations, including the Sinaloa Cartel, for control over trafficking routes running through the state. This kind of sustained high-stakes competition for territory tends to create enormous financial incentives for criminal organizations to corrupt local law enforcement wherever possible, since police officers who are willing to look the other way, provide information, or actively participate in criminal operations offer enormous strategic value to whichever cartel manages to buy their cooperation. Officers can be bribed with amounts of money far exceeding their official salaries, or in some cases, coerced through direct threats against themselves or their families, creating a police force that, at least in certain units or specific officers, ends up serving the interests of organized crime rather than the public they are officially sworn to protect. The specific detail that stands out most starkly in the Tierra Blanca case, when compared to other cases covered throughout this list, is just how mundane and ordinary the initial encounter between the victims and the people who would ultimately be responsible for their disappearance actually was. This was not a kidnapping carried out by armed men storming a party, breaking into a home, or ambushing a vehicle on a remote highway. This began with a traffic stop for speeding, one of the most routine and universally recognizable interactions between civilians and police that exists anywhere in the world. For the 5 young people pulled over that day, there was likely no reason at that specific moment to feel unusually afraid or suspicious of what was happening. Being stopped by police for speeding is something drivers everywhere have experienced at some point. An inconvenience, sometimes an annoyance, but rarely something that feels immediately life-threatening. That is precisely what makes this case so unsettling within the broader context of cartel violence covered across this entire list. Every other case here required its victims to be in a specific, identifiable situation carrying some degree of visible risk, whether that meant being at a party in a neighborhood contested by rival cartels, traveling through remote desert territory known to be fought over by multiple armed groups, or responding to a suspicious job offer that turned out to be a cartel recruitment trap. The 5 young people detained in Tierra Blanca were simply driving home from the beach and got pulled over for going too fast. The danger they encountered did not come from being in a dangerous location or making a risky decision. It came directly from the uniformed officers who stopped them, the exact people any ordinary driver would expect to represent safety and legal authority rather than a direct pipeline into the hands of organized crime. This detail is what makes the Tierra Blanca case such an important and disturbing addition to any accounting of cartel-related violence in Mexico. It demonstrates, through a single, documented, and officially acknowledged incident, that in certain parts of the country during this period, the presence of police at a traffic stop did not guarantee any kind of safety at all. In fact, according to the state's own Attorney General, the police themselves were the direct link connecting 5 ordinary young people to whatever criminal organization ultimately took custody of them and made them disappear. The 5 young people who left for a beach trip and never made it home represent, in the end, one of the clearest documented examples on this entire list of exactly how thin the line separating everyday life from cartel violence had become in parts of Mexico by 2017. It did not take a viral video, a case of mistaken identity involving rival gangs, or a remote desert encounter with nervous gunmen. It took a routine traffic stop, an unnamed criminal organization willing to accept whoever the police handed over, and officers willing to make that handoff instead of writing a simple speeding ticket. That closes out the full list of 10 cases. Across these stories, a clear and uncomfortable pattern shows up again and again. Ordinary young people doing ordinary things, whether attending a birthday party, working on a school project, responding to a job posting, conducting scientific research, or simply driving home from vacation, ended up caught in violence that had nothing to do with anything they had personally done. Some cases resulted in convictions, many did not. For nearly every family covered in this list, the search for full answers either took years or never fully concluded at all. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.